Welcome to Open to Debate. Today we're addressing a really complex and important question. Is the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu justified? Because this is such a complex conversation, it's necessary to ground the conversation with some facts for our audience. So, what is the ICC? Unlike the ICJ, it only targets individuals, and it prosecutes them for issues such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It's designed to complement, not replace, national criminal justice systems. Thus, it only has authority if the state isn't conducting or isn't able to conduct a good faith investigation. What's the process? Where is the case today? Well, it started with a determination by the prosecutor, Karim Khan, that there was sufficient evidence to prosecute Netanyahu. It's worth noting that he also put the Defense Minister Gallant and 3 Hamas leaders of prosecution too. And the warrants are really focused on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, starvation, lack of water, etc. But today, this debate is not about whether Netanyahu is guilty, but about whether there's enough evidence to justify issuing a warrant and whether the court has jurisdiction. Should Hamas and Israeli leaders be considered in the same bucket? Is this not a war of self-defense? Is Netanyahu not a democratically elected leader? Does somebody need to be held accountable? To discuss these questions and more, we have 2 phenomenal debaters. Here to argue that the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu is justified is Ken Roth. Ken is a leading expert in international human rights law and spent nearly 3 decades as the head of Human Rights Watch. He was once referred to as the godfather of human rights. Currently, he's a professor at Princeton, where he teaches at the School for Public and International Affairs. Ken, welcome to Open to Debate.
My pleasure to be here. It's very nice to have this opportunity.
Here to argue that the arrest warrant for Netanyahu is not, in fact, justified, we have Eugene Korovich. Eugene is the preeminent expert on international law, particularly regarding Israeli-Arab conflicts. He's been a principal architect of U.S. state laws around boycotts of Israel and has advised senior Israeli, U.S. and European officials on a variety of diplomatic issues. He's a professor of law at George Mason University and the executive director of Scalia Law School's Center for the Middle East and International Law. Eugene, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
Let's get to our opening statements. We want each of you to take a few minutes to explain your position. Ken, you're up first, and you're arguing that yes, the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu is justified. Please tell us why.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And let me divide my 4 minutes into 2 parts. One is to ask, does the ICC have the power to act here? And second, is there adequate evidence to justify this request for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant? Now, in terms of the ICC's powers, I think it's good to look to the objections made by the U.S. government, because those are telling, and that kind of runs the gamut. First, there was a suggestion that the ICC shouldn't act because Israel has never joined the court. But the ICC used what's known as territorial jurisdiction. It is addressing crimes committed within a state party, that is, within Palestine, in this case, within Gaza. And while the U.S. long objected to territorial jurisdiction, it lost that debate 25 years ago when the Rome Statute creating the ICC was adopted. It lost by a vote of 120-7. And indeed, the U.S. even gave up on that objection once territorial jurisdiction was used to charge Putin, because Russia never joined the court, but for crimes in Ukraine, which had conferred jurisdiction. So that objection's kind of out the window. Now, the second one is to say that, Palestine's not enough of a state to justify conferring jurisdiction. But the pretrial chamber of the ICC already ruled on that. They said that it is sufficiently a state. They looked to a 2012 UN General Assembly resolution adopted by a vote of 138-9, where they said Palestine is a non-member observer state sufficient to ratify treaties. And indeed, it's ratified a bunch of human rights treaties, which we should welcome, even though it doesn't always live up to the standards. Finally, Secretary of State Blinken suggested, Zini, as you noted, that the ICC has complementary jurisdiction. It's supposed to defer to good faith national prosecutions. The problem is that Israel has zero history of prosecuting senior officials for war crimes. And particularly in this case, it has never announced an investigation into Netanyahu's and Gallant's starvation strategy, even though Karim Khan visited the region twice and warned that the starvation strategy was his focus. So there's been no investigation whatsoever. And indeed, the Israeli publication 972 found that Israel was secretly monitoring the prosecutor's communications to try to open investigations to pretend that it was doing something, when in fact none of those investigations have gone anywhere. To the contrary, Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, literally threatened the prosecutor, did a sting operation against her husband, handed her cash as if to try to bribe or buy her off. None of this shows a conscientious commitment to justice. Now, as for the evidence, I think it's pretty clear that there is widespread starvation in Gaza. Now, Israel likes to blame everybody else, but in fact, if you look at the evidence, it is the primary reason. Defense Minister Gallant said early on, "I have ordered a complete siege in the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed." And since then, he's largely lived up to that. Now, the rule is that parties to a conflict must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded access of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. Israel hasn't done that. In fact, there is plenty of evidence that it is sort of engaged in this starvation by bureaucratic obstacle. Their trucks have been waiting 3 weeks to get in. They get to the end of the line. Israel finds some vague reason to say, oh, there's a dual-use item in there, like crutches or maternity kits, and sends them to the end of the line again. That kind of obstruction has led, both Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, and Cindy McCain, the World Food Program head, to say there is famine in Gaza. Now, Netanyahu opened up, a couple of extra border crossings when Biden pressed him, but then negated that promptly by starting the war in southern Gaza and cutting off the two main supplies. So that's the evidence of the deliberateness of this obstruction.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for your opening statement. Eugene, you disagree. You believe the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu is not justified. Please give us 4 minutes to make your case.
Thank you. The ICC is a court with no jurisdiction, which is indeed hardly a court, a track record of bias against Israel, particularly in this case, prosecuting a crime that has not been committed in a way that emboldens terror regimes and endangers America and makes it harder for America to defend itself. Let me go over some of those points now. A court with no jurisdiction. Israel did not join the ICC treaty, much like the United States. The United States not joining the ICC to not confer jurisdiction upon it is one of the last things that unites Democrats and Republicans. Neither Obama nor Biden have moved to join the court, understanding how problematic it is. As for the ICC's own self-serving determination that there is a Palestinian state, the ICC cannot bestow upon itself jurisdiction, nor can a vote of the United Nations General Assembly, which does not create states, make Palestine into a state when in fact it is not. Indeed, the ICC is barely a court. It is not some august tribunal dispensing justice around the world. It has only finalized convictions in 4 decades in atrocity cases over 2 decades and has been plagued with dysfunction. The supposedly impartial prosecution team picked by the ICC prosecutor includes members who have, before joining the ICC team, supported BDS, boycotts of Israel, already declared Prime Minister Netanyahu and Donald Trump to be war criminals, and declared that Israel is committed to systematically depriving the innocent of their most basic rights. Other members of the ICC team have been public and political activists for sanctions against Israel. This is hardly an impartial body. Turning to the lack of a crime, there is no evidence of starvation. Now, it's true that in March, a UN panel reported that famine was imminent in Gaza. But by May and June, the same panel had declared, the Famine Review Committee in its June report have declared that there is no evidence of famine. And while there may be some risk of it, There is simply no famine condition in Gaza. This is a UN body unaffiliated with Israel. Arif Hussein, the chief economist of the World Bank Food Program, admitted that none of the benchmarks of famine has been met, and there have been no identified casualties due to famine. All of the data on which the UN was advocating at the time the ICC issued its indictments have been questioned and revised. Now, this emboldens terror regimes. As soon as the ICC made clear it was going to indict Israeli leaders, guess who joined the jurisdiction of the court? The Hezbollah-controlled government of Lebanon. Now, this is not because they want to participate in international justice, but because they understand this is a tool to undermine Western democracy's ability to defend themselves. When Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon is joining your supposed justice mechanism, it's not a good sign for producing justice, because consider the incentives here. Hamas is not afraid of being indicted by the ICC because they know they will never be arrested, and indeed they know they are more likely to be killed by Israel, as one of the indictees already has been. But leaders of Western democracies have much more to lose by being indicted by the ICC, right? They come out of office, they leave office. So when they are in a war with a terror group that has started a genocidal war, this kind of even-handed, allegedly even-handed indictments essentially deters Western leaders from vigorously fighting wars of self-defense against genocidal terrorists.
Thank you, Eugene, and thanks to you both. You just heard your opponent's opening remarks. What would you say is their most egregious flaw in their argument? And Ken, I'll take it to you first, please.
Well, let me, if I could, pick two items. I mean, one is this claim there's no jurisdiction because Israel hasn't joined the court. The U.S. gave up on that objection. In fact, Lindsey Graham, the lead Republican senator, gave up on that objection. So that's just gone. Nobody buys that anymore. As for this claim that there is no evidence of famine, why is it that 34 children have died of malnutrition? Why is it that a World Health Organization survey at the end of May found that 85% of children had not eaten for an entire day at least once in the prior 3 days? That's famine.
Ken, thank you. Eugene, the same question to you, not responding to what Ken has just said, but to his opening remarks. What did you hear that you think is the most egregious flaw in his argument?
I think the most egregious flaw is assuming that the magical pronouncements of the ICC and the UN General Assembly create an actual reality. The ICC cannot create jurisdiction for itself over Israel by declaring Palestine to be a country. If Palestine is not a country, there is no jurisdiction, and that is why not just the United States, but 7 countries that are big supporters of the ICC have objected to ICC jurisdiction in this case, which has not been done in any other ICC proceeding. Similarly, the General Assembly is not a font of international law. It is a political talking shop dominated by dictatorial regimes. It cannot make Palestine a state either, and it cannot confer jurisdiction on the ICC.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I'm your moderator, Zania Wickett, and we're debating the question, is the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu justified? I'm here with debaters Ken Roth, professor and former head of Human Rights Watch, and Eugene Korovich, legal scholar at George Mason University. Before we launch into the discussion, I want to very briefly summarize what I heard in your arguments. Ken, you essentially put forward 2 arguments. You questioned, does the ICC have the power, and is there enough evidence to warrant the arrest warrants? You said it does have the power because Palestine is a member of the ICC and therefore territorial jurisdiction is covered, and Israel has zero history of prosecuting for war crimes, so there has been no investigation, and thus the ICC does have the authority. You said, does it have clear enough evidence? And to which you said, yes, clear widespread starvation in Gaza. This is a strategy by Israel. Eugene, you argued no, the arrest warrant isn't justified. You said that the ICC has a track record of bias against Israel, that the ICC is barely a court, it's plagued with dysfunction, that the prosecuting team was not independent, and that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction. Israel isn't a member and Palestine isn't a state. It was prosecuting against a crime that hasn't happened. There is no evidence of starvation. So those, in brief, are your summaries of your arguments. And now I want to get into the back and forth. And perhaps we can start with a 30,000-foot perspective. You both talked about the ICC and its legitimacy, but let me take a step back and ask you both the question, is the ICC an enforcer of international standards, or is it an arena of power? Are we creating standards, or are we protecting the weak? And should that matter in this case? And perhaps, Eugene, I'll go to you first.
So far the ICC has really not been much of anything in its existence, rather than a placeholder for cosmopolitan hopes of a world order united by rules that have not yet actually emerged. The ICC has not successfully held any incumbent leader responsible for war crimes. And we say the ICC, it has this august aura. I should point out, take Kenya, for example. The current president of Kenya, the former president of Kenya, were both ICC indictees, and the cases against them fell apart due to witnesses changing their testimony. Do we say that that delegitimizes Kenya? In fact, President Biden just promoted Kenya to a major non-NATO ally. The ICC is not in the real world a major font of legitimacy or of norms. It is more a permanent bureaucracy that has failed to succeed in its mission.
Not a credible bureaucracy, Ken.
Yeah. Well, look, I would agree that the ICC has been disappointing in its prosecutorial record, although, the Kenya case, the cases fell apart because Kenyatta and Ruto killed off the witnesses. So, let's be clear about who's at fault here. If you ask Vladimir Putin, is the ICC irrelevant? He had to just cancel his plan to visit the BRICS summit in South Africa because he would have been arrested. He cares a lot about this. Zena, you'd asked originally, is this just making up the standards? No, not at all. The Rome Statute, which is the guiding, document here, essentially codifies what's known as international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, as well as things like genocide and crimes against humanity. These are broadly accepted. No government, any place, denies the relevance. They all claim to abide by these standards. And so this is not, making up the standards. It's enforcing standards that everybody, including Israel, including the United States, has agreed to.
I want to emphasize this rare point of agreement with Ken and explain why it means something different to me. Indeed, the ICC can do very little if a home government decides to murder witnesses. Because the ICC has no police, because it has no real enforcement powers, it has really no way of doing justice, and that has a much greater effect in non-liberal democracies, right? So there's no way that they can credibly go and collect evidence against Hamas from Gaza, right? There's no way they can really get any real evidence from within Gaza because anyone there is mortally afraid of Hamas. In a liberal democracy like Israel, you have tons of people willing to criticize the government. You have people who can leave the country and criticize the government, come back and criticize the government, and nobody is going to be disappeared the way they would be in Gaza. That creates a fundamentally unequal playing field. Now, I agree that the rules also, as in the written in the Rome Statute, are largely universally agreed on. They change the wording of some provisions of the Geneva Convention, actually regarding settlements, to try to target Israel, but otherwise it largely follows the Geneva Convention. But under the Geneva Convention, starvation is a legitimate method of warfare when directed at the enemy force. And I'm just going to read to you from, for example, some military manuals. U.S. Defense Department Law of War Manual, starvation is a legitimate method of warfare. UK Manual, besieging a town, which is, in other words, surrounding it and not providing it with supplies, is in fact more humane than actually attacking it. And contrary to what Ken said, there is some basic requirement of allowing humanitarian supplies in for children and maternity cases, as they're called, pregnant or nursing women. And all of those can be suspended if there's a reason to believe that the supplies can be diverted by the enemy force. We know the United States has confirmed that aid into Gaza is diverted by Hamas. Given that, the fact that Israel has since the beginning of the war allowed 682,000 tons of aid, close to 36,000 trucks into Gaza is, I think, unprecedented in the history of siege. Indeed, Israel has not had a particularly rigorous siege, or what you would call a siege at all, even though it would be authorized to do so under the law of war.
Yeah, let me, if I could, I differ on both of these. First, the idea that it's impossible to investigate in Gaza is just poppycock. Human Rights Watch investigates in Gaza all the time. And yes, there's a threat from Hamas, but you use things like open source investigation, you use, communication like WhatsApp where you can, disguise who you're speaking with. There's tons of ways to collect evidence. We do it all the time, and the ICC does it as well. Now, in terms of, this claim that siege is allowed if you're only besieging a military force. It is not allowed when civilians are involved. And just to read the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the official interpreter of humanitarian law, there's no qualification. If the military doesn't take it, you have to send in food. It just says unequivocally, the parties to the conflict must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. And the reason there's no military qualification is because the guys with the guns always take the food first. By definition, every conflict in the world. And so if you allowed a little, diversion of food by the armed forces to mean you don't have to deliver any food, starvation would be a regular tool. It's not. It's a war crime. And so this idea that, if you have a military kind of on a cliff by itself, you can besiege them, yes, that's not Gaza, where there's 2.1 million civilians.
So here we sharply disagree, because the military manuals, which basically describe the law of war as it's recorded in the Geneva Convention and its additional protocols, make clear that a siege is allowed so long as the harm to civilians is proportional. Now, the fact that it talks about civilian harm means clearly we're talking about a siege of a target, a city, which includes both military and civilian populations. And indeed, that is what the United States did in the siege of Mosul, where it surrounded an Iraqi town of hundreds of thousands of people, and with its allied forces besieged it. Indeed, the only time a siege is illegal is when it is designed for the purpose of denying aid to a civilian population, which presumes that a siege that includes a civilian population is, in fact, legal. And I think what Ken is saying is that that Israel cannot besiege Gaza because Hamas is going to steal the food. So if the problem is Hamas is stealing the food, charge Hamas. And that's another extraordinary thing about the prosecution's allegations. Even though, according to the FRC, there is not starvation in Gaza. Let's say there are some malnutrited people. Let's assume we have no idea whether that's because Israel should be allowing 1 million trucks rather than 600,000, or because Hamas is stealing the food, criminals are stealing the food. And what happens inside Gaza is, in fact, not Israel's responsibility. Hamas, if anyone, should be charged with those crimes, but they're not being charged with them.
Can I pick up? You used a word that's a really important word in the human rights space, which is proportionality. And perhaps I can turn this on, that was a word you used, Eugene, and I can turn this on Ken. Is there something here about proportionality, or more specifically disproportionality, insofar as the actions from one side are disproportionate from the actions from the other side?
Well, the proportionality charge comes up really much more in terms of the way the war is being fought. When Israel drops a 2,000-pound bomb, which basically kills everybody within the radius of 2 football fields, in the middle of a populated area, because there's ostensibly a Hamas presence somewhere in the middle of that, that is disproportionate. That's why you have this huge civilian toll. That's why so many women and children are being killed. But coming back to this idea that Hamas is to blame because of Israel's obstruction of the trucks, 3-week wait to get into Gaza, that Hamas is to blame because Israel's shooting at the people who are delivering the aid, having killed 250 humanitarian workers, that Israel's shooting at the police who are trying to maintain order, that Israel's shooting at the people who are lining up to get the food. Come on, this is not Hamas, this is Israel. This is the starvation strategy.
Let me elevate the discussion to a slightly different perspective. We've talked a little bit about the legitimacy of the ICC And I think there's a clear distinction or a difference of opinion as to whether the ICC is legitimate. Can we delve a little bit into the question of jurisdiction? This question that we raised earlier of is Israel prosecuting the cases that come before it? And Ken, you suggested not, and Eugene, yes? The question's for you. Is Israel prosecuting the cases that come before it? Is it holding people accountable for their actions that we've heard described?
The ICC has a doctrine. I'll briefly define it. That it only investigates again, if the ICC has only convicted 4 people finally after all appeals of all atrocity crimes in the past 20-some years in the world, it shows it has a very limited bandwidth and could only go after the worst of the worst. So part of a way of supposedly pacing itself is it does not intervene when there is an adequate national justice system that can investigate. That does not mean that there need to be domestic charges for the ICC not to have jurisdiction because of complementarity. Let's take a case in which, for example, the domestic legal system does not think a crime has committed. Right? You don't need to charge people just to satisfy the ICC. Right? Rather, so long as there is a well-functioning domestic legal system like we have in the United States, like we have in Israel, the ICC should stand back. Indeed, the ICC found that domestic proceedings in countries like Guyana and Venezuela were enough to make them hold back. The mere lack of prosecution does not mean that there's some kind of cover-up. It could mean that the Israeli authorities believe, much like Joe Biden, who said that there's no starvation in Gaza, that there is no crimes to prosecute.
Yeah, I mean, the standard here is not, do you have an adequate justice system? That's this incredibly abstract assessment. It's rather, is there a conscientious investigation and, if appropriate, prosecution of the particular crime? So Eugene is right that if Israel were to announce an investigation and find that there was no crime, then that may be sufficient if it was done in good faith, but they haven't even done that. Karim Khan twice visited the region, said, I am looking at starvation. This is my number one priority. Israel still to this day, having announced 70 supposed investigations, has never announced an investigation into the starvation strategy. They just are going about, closing their eyes and pretending it's not there. That is zero. That is not a good faith investigation, let alone prosecution.
In fact, there's actually proceedings before the Israeli Supreme Court right now over the aid that goes into Gaza. Israel has a kind of very unusual legal system where the Supreme Court can be directly involved in everything, and the Supreme Court does in fact examine how much aid goes into Gaza. But the idea that Karim Khan said something and Israel's under a legal obligation to investigate is preposterous because, of course, Israel doesn't recognize the ICC's jurisdiction, much like the United States. If Karim Khan said to the United States, you're guilty of war crimes in Gaza, which some people believe, it's not a thing that Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, is not going to investigate Joe Biden, because why should they? They don't recognize the ICC. And this is another example of this bootstrapping. The ICC doesn't get to make countries have investigations by declaring a non-state to be a state, declaring a non-crime to be a crime, and then saying, why aren't you investigating?
Can I just, Eugene is pretending that Ukraine never happened. Okay, in other words, what he's describing is the U.S. position before Putin was charged. When Putin was charged, the U.S. position changed. It said that if a crime is committed on the territory of a member state, the court does have jurisdiction. So if somebody were to say, oh, United States, you committed a crime in Ukraine, they damn well better investigate or they could be prosecuted because that's U.S. policy now.
I'd like to say that, first of all, Ukraine does not necessarily mean a total change in U.S. policy, but I'm not arguing against territorial jurisdiction. I'm arguing that there is no state of Palestine whose territory this could be committed on. Palestine is, in fact, not a state, which is why we say, let's have a two-state solution, right? Because there is not currently a Palestinian state. That's why people call for a two-state solution. And thus, there is no territory for territorial jurisdiction. It's kind of like if ISIS accepted ICC jurisdiction and then proceeded to bring cases against America for the campaign there.
I want to take you slightly back because there have been approximately 38,000 deaths in Gaza. Approximately, we can dispute the numbers, but significant numbers. Isn't it fair to for somebody whether it's the Israeli courts or it's the ICC, to ask the question that somebody should be held responsible for those deaths?
So yeah, let me take that. We don't know if there's 38,000 deaths. 38,000 is simply what the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, says.
It's a significant number.
We for sure there's a significant number, and we know that there's a significant number, at least from the fact that Israel says they've killed, let's say, about 17,000 Hamas members now. So that's 17,000, and Israel takes a very conservative estimate of their casualty counts based on only what they can really confirm. So at least half of what the Gazans are claiming, what Hamas is claiming, is combatants. They also add to their total, apparently, the numbers are very not transparent, everyone who has died of natural causes since the war began. And when you subtract all this out, what you have is a civilian casualty rate which is lower than the military casualty rate, and that is extraordinary in urban conflict, and it's particularly extraordinary in a conflict where one side is trying to maximize its civilian casualties to try to get international intervention. The Iraq War caused 460,000 all-cause deaths, according to the PLOS Medicine Survey. World War II, German military civilian casualties are estimated at over 2 million. So should we not have fought World War II? I think today, under these standards, we could not have beaten Nazi Germany. What about something more recent under the Biden administration? We don't want to go back to the Bush era. In the Battle of Mosul, 10,000 civilians were killed simply to take out a few thousand ISIS terrorists. In none of these cases did we say, oh, there's a lot of dead, let's have an investigation.
Yeah, I mean, let me address two parts of what Eugene just said. First of all, the idea of whether Palestine is a state or not is actually not a black or white situation. In other words, for it to be completely a state, the Security Council, meaning the U.S. veto, would have to be overcome. But absent that, the UN General Assembly decides, is something sufficiently a state for the purpose of ratifying treaties? That's longstanding practice. And that is why Palestine was able to ratify not only a whole bunch of human rights treaties, which we should welcome, but also the Rome Statute of the ICC. So that's why it's here. And, Israel can challenge that if it ever shows up in The Hague, but that is the ruling of the court. And that is actually accepted by the vast majority of states of the world. Now, in terms of civilian casualties, the test is actually not, one gross number versus another gross number. I mean, Eugene, tries to sort of suggest that, Israel's conservative in identifying the number of Hamas militants killed. In fact, it's the Gaza Health Ministry that's conservative because it doesn't count people who are buried in the rubble. It doesn't count people who have died indirectly due to, the destruction of the healthcare system. But the real way to test proportionality is to look at each attack. That's the way it's supposed to be done. And so, let's say there's a Hamas person who's being attacked. When you use a 2,000-pound bomb and you predictably kill every civilian around there, that's disproportionate. When you attack the hospitals, ostensibly there's a Hamas militant there. They destroy the healthcare system at a point when Palestinians acutely need it. That's disproportionate. And I could go on.
I want to move us into the political realm a little bit. And again, this is for you, Eugene, to start on if you can. There have been fairly strong allegations of anti-Semitism towards anybody who believes that the warrant is justified. Do you agree with those allegations, or what would you need to see to make an allegation against Netanyahu not anti-Semitic?
I have not seen those allegations. There's certainly a lot of anti-Semitism in international institutions, like the United Nations General Assembly, on which the ICC, as we've seen, relies for the predicates for its jurisdiction. But I have not made such allegations, and I don't know who has.
Oh, yeah, but the person who has is Netanyahu. The first response was, Netanyahu said when he was charged.
Ken, 1 second. Yeah. I'll come to you, I promise.
I want to say, it's very important to define anti-Semitism. I think in our contemporary world, anti-Semitism does not mean some kind of hatred of Jews for no reason, right? Anti-Semitism means treating Israel by standards not applied to any other country in the world. That's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition. And I think that is, in fact, what we see here. Now, the motives, what the underlying motive is it a detestation of Jews, or is it that the ICC is under pressure to indict non-African leaders, having only really pursued African leaders so far and not being able to have any success with Putin? So now they have to do this as a kind of political expedient. That's Kremlinology that I don't want to engage in. And I don't think it's particularly relevant. It's clearly biased, right? Its bias is demonstrated by the statements of the members of its team prior to the investigation. Those are not impartial statements. What the deep psychology is behind it is not for me to discern.
Okay, Ken, you wanted to come back on that.
Yes, I mean, first of all, the first person who charged Karim Khan with being one of the world's biggest anti-Semites, I think that was the allegation, was Netanyahu himself. So the idea that we haven't heard this, he said it. Now, this cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an acute problem today. But when people think that the charge is made simply as a way to try to deflect criticism of Israel, that cheapens a concept, anti-Semitism, at a point when it's really needed. Now, I also want to come back to Eugene's claim, which he's now made twice, that Karim Khan's team is somehow anti-Semitic or biased. The first thing to make clear is that the only member of the prosecutorial team who is identified is a long-experienced British prosecutor. He has a private team working for him. I don't know who they are. Eugene doesn't know who they are. What Eugene is referring to is an advisory team set up after the charges had been filed, where they put an op-ed into the Financial Times saying, we reviewed this evidence and we thought it was appropriate.
I was not referring just to the special advisory team, but also to long-standing advisors appointed long before this who have been working with the ICC for several years.
Okay, we're going to bring in some other voices now, members of the audience. And first, I'd like to welcome in Dr. Chile Ebo Osuji, the former president of the ICC from 2018 to 2021. Previously, he'd spent 6 years as a trial judge for the ICC, and he's currently the distinguished international jurist at the Toronto Metropolitan University Law School. Dr. Ebo Osuji, please join us.
Thank you very much. There's been a lot said, and I wouldn't get into commentary. A lot of it has been political, I would say, allegations. But let me ask a legal question. I have heard it said many times, many references to what happened during the First World War, the dropping of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bombing of Dresden and all that. I've had references to those conducts as an argument against which what's happening now may be appraised for correctness. And I've also think I've heard it now by Professor Dr. Mr. Korovich. My question to both of you is it possible to accept that after the Second World War, there was a demarcation in conduct and law, such as to say that from then on, a lot of things that happened in the course of that war should no longer happen moving forward? Be it genocide that was committed, and then we had a Genocide Convention in 1948, and in 1949 we had the Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth, such that we now have a new order of international law that makes it invalid to be referring back to what happened during the Second World War.
Thank you for that. Eugene, do you want to start with that, and then I'll come to Ken?
Certainly. So I know that there's many international legal experts and professors who think so, or who want it to be true. But when you look at the military manuals of Western militaries, they in fact cite practice from World War II. And we don't need to get into Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, as I mentioned, millions of German civilians died during the war. And if in fact the rules have changed, right, we don't know that World War II could have been won under the rules that are now being pushed forward, which I don't believe have been adopted, which I don't believe are the rules actually accepted by countries, but I know there are people who want there to be new rules, might be using Israel as a test case. And if we had fought under those rules, in fact, the final solution might have been completed, and in fact, Europe might still be under Nazi domination. But we don't have to go back that far, because I can also give examples of the wars in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and the war against ISIS in Syria, none of which have had as low a proportion of civilian casualties as the current Israeli war in Gaza, despite Hamas's best efforts to the contrary. And so I have to say, there's no land war, there's no defensive war when a country is fighting actually a war on territory, not far away, not a war that it can walk away from, that would satisfy these tests.
Thank you. Ken, do you have a response?
I do. The argument that you appropriately make was one that actually Netanyahu made to Biden. You may recall that Biden said Israel is fighting indiscriminately, a war crime. Netanyahu said, what do you mean? You dropped the atomic bomb. You indiscriminately bombed in Germany, so why are you criticizing us? And Biden rightly said, the law has changed. And as you point out, that's because in 1949, the world, appalled by the way the Second World War had been fought, adopted the Geneva Conventions. They were supplemented in 1977 with what are known as the additional protocols. And so those are the new rules that everybody accepts. Israel
and America did not accept the additional protocols.
But they all accept the Geneva Conventions of 49. They accept the standards in the protocols. And so to say that, we can go back to World War II standards is like none of this happened, that's living in a dream world, because the rules are different. And so if you're going to go back, now the fact that there are violations doesn't mean that the rules don't exist. If there's a murder in New York City, does that mean that there's no law against murder? Come on, let's be real. The rules are there, and most militaries say they uphold them. If they fall short, that's why you have institutions like the ICC to hold people to account.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Dr. Ebo Asuji. I'd now like to introduce John Spencer, the chair of Urban Warfare Studies with the Madison Policy Forum. He's a veteran, and he's the host of the podcast, the Urban Warfare Podcast. John.
Thanks. My question is for Ken as a military scholar looking at sieges, which I define as the complete cutting off of all resources into an area for the goal of convincing the enemy to give up, to strangle them of resources, such as the siege of Leningrad, siege of Sarajevo. I find the ICC claim baseless just based on sheer evidence of the number of trucks, the number of water pipes, the airdrops. The only evidence that's in this case that is 34 malnutrition children that Hamas states died from a lack of resources, when 29,000 trucks. There are actually single-digit number of days that nothing goes into Gaza from October 7th to October 19th. I don't know what people are defining as siege, but I have a completely different definition. And if Israel is, so that's the question is, well, how do you define a siege? And if Israel is using a siege as a form of warfare, they're the most incompetent military that's ever tried to do it.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, Israel is smart enough to know that they can't do 100% siege. So what they're doing is they're letting in drips and drabs of aid. Before October 7th, typically 500 trucks entered Gaza every single day. Israel's been allowing in on average of 100 trucks. And so, yes, food gets in. People are not dying. They're smart enough to do that. But they are starving. And so, in fact, what you see is, there was a survey done by the humanitarian groups there that found that the average calories that people were consuming at one of the low points was like 15%, 1.5. That's why people are not able to feed their children at all, anything, 1 out of 3 days. That's a siege. That is sufficient starvation strategy to justify the war crimes charges.
Eugene, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree that plenty of aid is getting into Gaza. And more importantly, Israel has no obligation to maintain the pre-war levels of trucks because there is, in fact, a war on. The FRSRC, Food Monitoring Program, issued a report in June that said that the previous reports that had been issued were based on faulty assumptions, had deliberate choices over assumptions, and lacked supporting evidence. And the survey that Ken keeps mentioning is like literally a survey. They would call up people in Gaza saying, hey, are you hungry? Now, needless to say, they're aware of the political context in which this takes place. So whether they say they're hungry or not is not particularly good evidence. We're not talking about actual medical evidence of malnutrition, but literally a phone survey.
Eugene, thank you. Thanks so much, John, for joining us. I'd now like to introduce Jennifer Trahan, clinical professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs and an expert in international law.
Ken, we saw enthusiasm from members of Congress when the ICC issued warrants regarding Ukraine, and similarly pursuing members of the LRA. But how do we convince Congress, the general public? You can't pick and choose on international justice. They're threatening sanctions for pursuing the situation in Israel and Palestine. How do we get beyond this double standard approach? And to Eugene, just broadening it out, I mean, the allegations or the facts suggested by the prosecutor aren't just starvation, but also attacks on civilians, killing aid workers, cutting off electricity supplies. Are you suggesting there should be no justice for these crimes? And if the ICC has jurisdiction, noting they can't do the October 7 cases, they've leveled charges for war crimes and crimes against humanity, 8 types of charges against the leaders of Hamas. So are you opposed to those cases moving forward too?
Ken, why don't you start, answer, and then we'll come to you, Eugene. Ken, thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah. I mean, I think in response to Jennifer's question, I mean, it's correct that, some members of Congress are shameless and say, we welcome the ICC's action in Ukraine, but not in Gaza. I have to say that that's not the U.S. government position. Indeed, I was called by a senior official to say, we don't believe in this objection to territorial jurisdiction anymore. That is gone. Please be careful not to suggest that. So, nobody objects to territorial jurisdiction now other than Israel and its defenders. Now, it's also worth noting that the Biden administration has been very upfront in criticizing Netanyahu's starvation strategy. Indeed, Biden's major emphasis has been to put pressure on Netanyahu, at one point even threatening to cut aid unless he started easing this obstruction of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. And at that point, that's when Netanyahu opened up, 2 new border crossings in the north, but immediately negated the effect by launching the war in the south and shutting down the 2 principal border crossings in the south that had been delivering the bulk of the aid.
Thank you, Ken. Eugene?
So first of all, on the question, and I'll answer some other things at the same time. Ken keeps saying there's this objection to territorial jurisdiction has been waived. The principal objection to ICC jurisdiction here, other than complementarity, is there is no state of Palestine, and even if there were, we have no clear borders for it. And in the Oslo Accords, it delegated criminal jurisdiction over Israelis to the Palestinian Authority delegated it to Israel, so they can't delegate it again to the ICC. This is not a standard exercise of territorial jurisdiction by any means, and that is actually, to answer your question to Ken, in part, what makes the treatment of Ukraine and the Israel case consistent, right? Congress understands that Ukraine is a country. Congress understands that Palestine, Gaza, is in fact not a country and thus cannot join the ICC. Now, whether, nor does indicting Hamas leaders in any way make it equal. I actually don't care if Hamas is investigated by the ICC, because I can say right now, the ICC is never going to get a single Hamas member on trial in The Hague. First of all, one of them has already been killed, of the 3 indictees, likely killed in an Israeli airstrike this week. They're not afraid of, 10 years in a jail cell in The Hague. It will not deter them. On the other hand, Western democratic leaders who are not launching genocidal invasions of murder, rape, and mutilation of neighboring countries, they have a lot more to lose through the entire process because they come in and out of office. So I think this puts a thumb on the scale for Hamas. And how do we know? Because Hezbollah now is eager to join the ICC. Why? They know there's a war coming with Israel, a likely war, because Hezbollah is shelling Israel every day. How are they getting prepared for that war? By giving jurisdiction to the ICC. I think that's the clearest proof that the ICC is a tool of terrorist regimes in this game.
Thanks so much for joining us, Jennifer. Finally, I'd like to introduce Josh Hammer, the senior editor-at-large at Newsweek and the host of the podcast, The Josh Hammer Show. Josh.
So thank you for the opportunity here. So Danielle Haas, who's a senior Human Rights Watch director, she sent a resignation email to her colleagues in November 16th, 1 month after October 7th, where she basically said that as the organization grew in the aftermath of the Hamas massacres, that Human Rights Watch had abandoned all principles. So I'm actually just wondering, what actually are those principles?
They're international standards, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, the standards that everybody accepts. So there should be no surprise here. Human Rights Watch has done this in 100 countries around the world, applying the same fact-finding, the same standards. In fact, that's why we're such a target, because we have such credibility.
Thank you, Josh. And now it's time to bring it home with closing remarks. Ken, you have the first opportunity for a closing remark. Give us one last reason why you believe the ICC's warrant for Netanyahu is justified.
Well, what I'd like to do here actually is to say that if it's not justified, what Netanyahu should do is to get on a plane and go to The Hague and contest it. This is not such a wacko thing because we've already referred earlier to former Kenyan President Kenyatta, and that's exactly what he did. By flying to The Hague, he made clear that he was going to voluntarily cooperate. He was then never, arrested formally. He was able to go back and forth and continue to be president. Ended up contesting the charges. Now, in that case, he killed off the witnesses and the charges against him were dismissed. But he, in a sense, cooperated and tried to beat the charges. That's not what Netanyahu is doing. He's afraid to show up in The Hague because he's got no leg to stand on. He's clearly pursuing a starvation strategy. If the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction, go contest that in The Hague. He won't do that. So the fact that instead, he's saying, Karim Khan is an anti-Semite, he's trying to, kind of wave all these diversionary flags and try to prevent us from looking at the fact that there's been obvious, huge deprivation in Gaza. Beyond the indiscriminate bombarding, beyond the disproportionate attacks, there's clearly widespread hunger, spreading illness. Some children are dying from malnutrition. If that's not true, show up to The Hague and disprove it. But he won't do that.
Ken, thank you so much for your closing remarks. Eugene, you'll have the final word here in this debate. Convince us again why the ICC's warrant for Netanyahu is not, in fact, justified. And you have 2 minutes.
There is simply no starvation strategy, and there is no starvation. After the ICC issued its warrants, a UN-related food monitoring committee revised its own earlier estimates of the food situation in Gaza and said there is no basis to believe there is currently a famine. The way in which Israel has fought this war, now any war has dislocations and any war causes suffering for civilians, especially one fought like Hamas does, where it puts all of its targets in civilian population centers, where it builds tunnels under civilian places, where it takes over UN facilities, where it takes over schools, and where not a single civilian is allowed to flee the conflict across the border into Egypt. All of those make this a different conflict from any other conflict we have seen in recent times, but nonetheless, Israel has been more careful about civilians in Gaza than any power in any fight in recent times. And Ken said in his talks, just because there's other violations doesn't mean that this is okay. But we can go through every urban fight in modern times, Afghanistan, Mosul, we can talk about the war in Iraq. We don't have to go back to World War II. If all of those are violations, then not only President Bush, but President Biden and his vice president, President Obama and his vice president Biden are all war criminals. By that definition, yes, if everybody is a war criminal, it's hard to say that Israeli leaders are not. But this is not the standard that has ever been used. And it's being applied to Israel because Israel is a small, vulnerable country. And applying these standards to it is designed to keep it from effectively defending itself from Hamas. And when Hamas wins, I'm sure Ken will say, well, let's indict them too for murdering all of the Jews of Israel. But it won't help and it won't be effective. And that cannot be allowed to happen.
Thank you, Eugene. And that concludes our debate. I'd like to thank our debaters, Ken Roth and Eugene Korovich. We also appreciate you showing up, approaching this debate with an open mind and bringing your thoughtful disagreement to the table. In short, you're being open to debate. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for bringing their expert questions to the table. Thank you, Dr. Chile Ebo Osuji, Josh Hammer, Jennifer Trahan, and John Spencer. Thank you for listening to Open to Debate. As a non-profit working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, the Rosencrantz Foundation, and supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman, our CEO is Claire Connor, and Leah Mathau is our Chief Content Officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our Chief Advancement Officer. This episode was produced by Alexis Pankwazi and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Andrew Foote. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Eric Gross, Gabrielle Yanucelli, Rachel Kemp, and Linda Lee. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement, and I'm Zania Wickett. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.